PlayStation 3 is the most ambitious console of all time, but that came at a cost. Not only was this an incredibly competitive generation for PlayStation, but the PS3 put Sony under real financial strain. This, my friends, is the story of every PlayStation 3 ever made. After a string of wins with the PS1, PS2, and PSP, it's safe to say that Sony were feeling on top of the world. I mean, why not? After a mere 2 generations, PlayStation had absolutely destroyed Sega, embarrassed Nintendo, and handily outperformed the upstart Xbox. Most importantly, gamers were incredibly excited for the next generation. There was a real appetite inside Sony to go bigger and bolder for what would turn into the PlayStation 3. The dawn of the HD era was quickly approaching, and while it wasn't as drastic a leap as the transition from PS1 to PS2, it still presented a significant challenge that's a lot more impressive than the generational upgrades that we see these days. High-definition TVs were just starting to become popular, and Sony had a couple of key pieces of tech in their back pocket. The first was Blu-ray, a Sony-developed successor to the DVD, offering a massive 50 gigabytes of storage capacity, over 5 times that of a DVD. This was crucial for the larger, more detailed HD games that would come to define the PS3 era. But Sony wasn't just interested in a bigger disc. They were also locked in a format war with HD DVD, a cheaper but lower capacity option. Now this was crucial for Sony, as Microsoft was backing HD DVD with the Xbox 360, although the console itself only used DVD. An HD DVD player for 360 was eventually released, but only as an add-on that was a bit of a tough sell. Beyond being able to play high-def video, it didn't really do a lot because no games actually shipped on HD DVD. Regardless, Sony didn't know any of this at the time. For them, the mission was clear. Blu-ray had to win. They were banking hard on the PS3 to replicate the PS2's success in establishing DVD as the standard. With the benefit of hindsight, the choice to commit to Blu-ray was a no-brainer, especially when you consider that 2 generations and 18 years later, it's still the standard not only on PlayStation, but even Xbox today. But back in the mid-2000s, while Microsoft's support for HD DVD posed a threat, Sony was equally focused on the Xbox 360 itself. Even though the original Xbox only saw modest success, and Microsoft lost a lot of money with it, it did have features that Sony couldn't ignore. More powerful hardware, a built-in hard drive, and the excellent online experience of Xbox Live clearly served as benchmarks for Sony during the PS3's development. However, the real changes came from, shall we say, Sony being a little too ambitious when it came to the technical side. Let me introduce to you, my friends, the Cell processor. This was an incredibly bold project by Sony as well as Toshiba and IBM, especially when you compare it to the dual-core CPUs that were common in PCs of the time. The Cell was an 8-core processor. Okay, so that's actually a slight exaggeration, as it actually had 1 classic CPU cores that was paired with 7 SPUs that you could consider to be like baby cores. I mean, I'm simplifying a lot here, but through today's lens, when you really think about it, this is not weird, right? Both the following PS4 as well as the PS5 also utilize 8-core CPUs, as do tons of PCs today. But in 2006, this was completely wild. The Cell processor had the potential for incredible performance in tasks that could be split across multiple cores, such as physics and AI. But the downsides were real. Developers were just starting to design game engines to utilize a couple CPU cores, not a complex network of SPUs, which required serious knowledge to get the most out of. Making matters worse, the heavily multi-core approach meant single-threaded tasks were slower. Think the difference between you and 6 of your friends drinking out of 7 little straws at the same time versus chugging straight from the bottle, but having to do it one at a time. I mean, sure, the multi-strawing is better in theory, but then you need to develop group suction control. All of this resulted in mini games running worse in the beginning on the PS3 than the Xbox 360, with its more conventional, if outright less powerful processor. You know, I probably should explain that one better, but you get the idea, right? Multi-cores, multiple things, but there's only so much suctitude. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it took quite literally the entire 7-year lifespan of the PS3 for developers like Naughty Dog to really squeeze everything out of the PlayStation with incredible games like The Last of Us. The PS3 was an enormously capable console. It just took a while to get your head around it. Now, the cell processor's complexity wasn't the only challenge Sony faced, though. The sheer cost of developing it was immense, and the development process itself was filled with delays. This allowed Microsoft to gain a full 1-year head start with the Xbox 360's release in 2005. By the time the PS3 was ready, it was significantly more expensive and complex than its competitor. Now, I think most people know this, but it really is worth reiterating that the PlayStation 3 was eye-wateringly expensive, with the base 20GB model starting at $500 and the 60GB model at $600. Double the PS2's launch price. Now, that base 20GB model lacked a lot of stuff to save the $100, and I'll break down the whole lineup in a minute, but suffice it to say that the 60GB was pretty clearly the real PS3. But $600 was just an astronomical price that's equivalent to like $900 in 2024. Now, the high price and missing features weren't the only challenges that Sony faced. Let's look at the pricing of the Xbox 360. It was much more reasonable, at $300 for the core model and $400 for the Elite. Making matters worse, Sony was estimated to be losing between $200 to $300 on every console they sold. They had undoubtedly built one of the most technically advanced consoles of all time, but at what cost? Oh yeah, the cost of $200 more than its rival. Even for Sony, who were coming off the enormous success of the PS2, this was nothing short of a financial disaster. It's part of the reason I think we've never seen such an ambitious console since. Ignoring the piles of money that Sony burned through in the PS3 generation, something that this chart they recently showed off really makes clear in context, they were onto something here. Funny enough, the first showing of the PS3 was somehow even more ambitious. Not only did it feature HDMI, which was a first for a console, but originally, Sony wanted to ship the PS3 with 2 HDMI ports for multi-monitor support. You know, sometimes I honestly wonder what would have happened if the engineers for the PS3 were really allowed to go wild. Oh wait, no, we don't have to think about that. They would have bankrupted Sony immediately. Now, I'm not sure I can find footage of this, but I remember attending a talk, I think it was GDC or maybe like PlayStation Experience, and Naughty Dog were up on stage, and at the very beginning of the PS4 generation, they were talking about how they had been porting Last of Us, and there was a slide that showed the performance of the CPU on the PS3 was actually higher than on the PS4, at least the theoretical max of what you could get out of the cell. And to me, I think that's a real eye-opener to how far ahead of its time the PS3 was. And I think it's also a big reason why we still don't have official PS3 backwards compatibility today, unlike the Xbox. And also why the community behind RPCS3 had performed minor miracles to get the PS3 emulation up and running, even on today's beefiest gaming PC. I mean, we just don't see huge leaps and risks like this with consoles today. Although, maybe for good reason. The PlayStation 3 launch was, to put it mildly, absolute insanity. After dominating the landscape with the PS2, anticipation for Sony's next-gen console was off the charts. Originally slated for a spring 2006 release, Sony pushed the launch back to November, leaving gamers to dream about what surely would be the most impressive console of all time. Now, console launches have always been hectic, with die-hard fans camping out and limited supplies inevitably leading to shortages. Now, most people think about the Wii in this regard, which of course straight up caused fights around Black Friday. But the PS3 launch? Yeah. So let's start with Japan, where the first PS3s hit shelves just a few days before America in November of '06. In a moment of pure showmanship, good old Ken Kutaragi himself was there to hand over the very first retail units. All 82,000 available consoles sold out in less than 24 hours. But this is where things started to get interesting. The very first buyer of a retail PS3 was arguably a scalper. Now, that's not too unusual by itself, but reports soon emerged that a large portion of the launch line consisted of people who had traveled to Japan just to buy a PS3. Was this just a testament to PlayStation's international appeal? Not quite. It turns out many of these buyers were actually proxies hired by wealthy businessmen. Their mission? Snag those precious PS3s and immediately flip them on eBay for double the price or more. scalping had evolved, just not in a good way. Now, while that's clearly not great, the US release was somehow even more of a disaster. It was a perfect storm of shortages, scalpers, and unruly crowds, with multiple shootings reported at PS3 launch events. Yes, you heard that right. People were literally risking their lives for a chance to get their hands on Sony's latest gaming machine. Imagine saving $600 to buy a PS3, spending all day in line, just to be terrified that someone was going to swipe it from you walking out of the store. Mr. Bolito, do you have a story about this?
So it all starts with my mom being in church.
Okay.
And we had been, at that point, trying to find a PS3 for a month.
This is 2006.
This is 2006, literally in December, like
Yeah.
a month after. I went to the mall with my cousin, and our mall had 3 GameStops. And on the
That's the most 2006 thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Our mall had 3 GameStops.
Yes, and as we were walking to the theater to watch Happy Feet, I was like, why not try to see if they had a PS3? And the third one did. And so I had to call my mom, be like, hey, church can wait. She's like, let me get the communion first. And she showed up not 20 minutes later because the church was down the road. And she was like, okay, we'll do it. And they triple bagged it because this was in the middle of Brooklyn and they were scared we were gonna get robbed.
That's fair, that's fair.
But nonetheless, 60 gig PS3 in hand with a copy of Ricky Bobby included for free.
Hell yeah.
Got my launch PS3.
Yeah, you have a good mom.
Yeah.
My mom would have been like, where's your $600? Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, Sony managed to move about 200,000 units in the first 2 weeks after the US launch. Not too bad considering the circumstances. Now, thankfully, the global launch that followed was slightly less eventful, but emphasis on the slightly. In Europe, a few months later, in March of 2007, Sony sold a staggering 600,000 units in just the first 2 days. This made the PS3 the fastest selling home game console in UK history, and the second fastest selling gaming device overall, just behind its portable sibling, the PSP. Interestingly, retailers reported a suspiciously low take rate of games, with some reports pegging only 3 out of every 4 PS3s being sold with a game at all. Why the discrepancy? Well, at the time, standalone Blu-ray players were insanely expensive, oftentimes costing around $1,000. The PS3, with its built-in Blu-ray capabilities, suddenly looked like a bargain for movie enthusiasts. Between home theater nerds and scalpers, it's almost like the only people not buying a PS3 at launch were gamers. Well, and people didn't have a large amount of disposable income on hand, which is, most people. Despite the early days looking a lot like the very successful PS2, the PS3 actually sold fewer units at launch than its predecessor. So what happened here? Well, there are a few factors at play. First, let's talk about that 6-month delay. Sony reportedly pushed back the launch due to issues with the Blu-ray copy protection. They probably also appreciated some more time to optimize the cell processor. But the real kicker? A severe lack of supply. Now, Sony did publicly admit that they were having trouble sourcing parts for the Blu-ray disc drive, leading to major hiccups in manufacturing. Initially, Sony planned to have 6 million units ready for the global launch. In reality, they only managed to produce around 2 million. Whoops. This supply issue was particularly problematic because, for the first time, PlayStation was facing some serious competition. Microsoft's Xbox 360 had launched a full year earlier, taking advantage of Sony's delays. Don't forget, it was hundreds of dollars less expensive, which meant that by the time the PS3 hit shelves, the 360 already had 1.4 million units in the hands of gamers, and tens of millions of people were just sitting on the fence to see if the PlayStation 3 was actually going to be worth it. Let me just take this off real quick. So this, my friends, is an original 60GB launch PS3. And as we'll discuss later, it is clearly the best one. Now we'll be playing some Gran Turismo 6, which admittedly is a game that came out significantly after the launch, but I think it does a good job of showing just what kind of potential the PS3 really had. You know, actually, if I recall correctly, Gran Turismo 6 was one of the games that pretty heavily leaned on the hard drive as well as the Blu-ray drive. And that's actually one of the things that most, especially later model PS3 games, really leaned on everything that they could get. Because one of the main issues with the PS3 is that even though the Blu-ray drive had tons of capacity, right? You could go up to 50 gigabytes for a game, but it was really slow, which meant that if you're loading 50 gigabytes of data off your Blu-ray, your load time's gonna be real slow. I'll say that while this game certainly looks quite a bit more low res compared to something like Gran Turismo 7, but considering that there's 2 generations between the two, I'd argue this actually is pretty solid. Now, if I can actually say anything negative about the PS3, it's actually the controller. So there's a bit of a backstory there. It's kind of long and convoluted, but basically there were 2 major versions of the PlayStation 3 controller. There was the 6-axis, which is what was launched with the PS3, and then there was the DualShock 3. The only real difference between them was just the fact that the 6-axis, the original launch controller, did not have any vibration, and this is a 6-axis, unfortunately, which means that I got no vibration. It's fine, I think a lot of people liked it, but this was definitely the generation where the Xbox had a far, far better controller. I still think the Xbox 360 controller runs rings around this one. Okay, I was only 13 seconds behind. You know, it's funny, if you go back and play a PS3 after, playing more modern consoles like a PS5 or something, the things that jump out to me really are the controllers and the load times, because the graphics, honestly, are not that bad. The ambitious technology packed into the PS3 came at a steep cost, both for Sony and for gamers. The company almost immediately began looking for ways to cut costs and bring the PS3's incredibly high price tag down to a more reasonable level. The launch model, retrospectively dubbed the 60 gig version, was a technological powerhouse, and it's not even arguable. It was the best PS3 ever made. It featured full hardware backwards compatibility with PS2 games, thanks to the inclusion of the Emotion engine from the PS2. It also boasted Wi-Fi, a card reader, and 4 USB ports. This was the premium experience that Sony had promised, but it came at a premium price. Sony also offered the 20 gigabyte model. This version ditched the card reader, cut the USB ports down to 2, and most significantly, removed Wi-Fi. The goal was clear: offer a slightly cheaper option to boost adoption. But Sony wasn't done cost cutting. Throughout 2007, they released a few more cut down versions, including an 80 gigabyte model, which while it had a bigger drive, entirely removed the hardware backwards compatibility for PS2 games, and cost the same $600 as the launch model. Then in late 2007, they made a major revision, including a new base model 40 gigabyte version. This trimmed all the remaining fat, including backwards compatibility altogether, the card readers, and they moved the cell processor to a newer, more efficient 65nm process that was cheaper to make. These changes did allow Sony to lower the price further to $399, somewhat more competitive with the Xbox 360, but at the cost of a console that a mere year into its life was losing features that many considered essential to the PS3 experience. The PS2 back compat was definitely the big one. These cut-down PS3s were the first PlayStation home consoles ever to lose backwards compatibility. I think it's safe to say that this was not normal, and especially with the benefit of hindsight, it makes it clear just how overly ambitious the plans for the PS3 were, causing massive headaches for Sony as they tried to wrestle the PlayStation 3 into a position of, not losing them truckloads of money every month. Throughout 2008 and 2009, Sony continued to tweak the formula, releasing 80GB and later 160GB versions. Now these were pretty straightforward changes, mostly maintaining the reduced feature set of the 40GB version, but with a bit more storage. While gamers were slowly getting on board with these changing PS3 models, some unexpected groups found some interesting uses for Sony's most powerful console. The raw performance of the cell processor caught the attention of some universities and research institutions who began buying PS3s en masse, networking them together to create makeshift supercomputers. The most notable example, the US Air Force. In 2010, they put together 1,760 PS3s to create a system used for radar enhancement and AI research. Now why go through all of this trouble? Well, it came down to cost. Game consoles are typically sold at a loss, as we've especially established in the case of the PS3, with manufacturers making their money back on game sales later on. For the Air Force's purposes, $400 per compute unit was an absolute steal. Comparable specialized hardware cost around $10,000 per unit. The fact that the cell processor could run Linux made it a breeze to use for custom programs. This brings us to a controversial chapter in the PS3's history. Originally, Sony proudly touted the PS3's ability to run Linux as a key feature, as they did with the PS2 before. It allowed tech-savvy users to turn their consoles into fully functional computers. However, in 2010, Sony abruptly removed this capability via a firmware update. Now this was different from the updated models of the PS3 that slowly removed features to save money. One day you woke up and your PS3 wanted to download an update that straight up removed a major feature. The backlash, I probably don't need to tell you, was swift. Users felt betrayed, especially those who had purchased the PS3 specifically for its Linux support. A class action lawsuit was filed, claiming that Sony had engaged in deceptive marketing. After years of legal battles, Sony eventually settled, agreeing to pay a meager $3.75 million to the affected users. That's probably like, what, 25 cents per person or whatever? But even the removal of Linux support was far from the biggest issue plaguing PS3 owners. A couple of years into the console's lifecycle, reports began to surface of a mysterious and dreaded malfunction: the yellow light of death. Picture this. You sit down for a gaming session, hit the power button on your PS3, and instead of the comforting blue light, you're greeted with an ominous yellow flash. Your heart sinks as you realize your console is now little more than an expensive paperweight. The yellow light of death, or the YLOD, became notorious among PS3 owners. It typically struck around the 2-year mark, conveniently after Sony's 1-year warranty had expired. Now, the exact cause was debated for years, but it's now generally understood to be related to overheating. The high temperatures inside the console could cause solder points on the motherboard to crack, leading to failures in critical components like the GPU. Now, it is important to put this issue into perspective. While it seemed like the yellow light was running rampant, in reality only a small percentage of all PS3s were affected. Now, that's still thousands of consoles, to be sure, and absolutely devastating if you were one of the unlucky ones. But it pales in comparison to the infamous red ring of death that plagued the Xbox 360. Some sources estimate that up to 50% of launch model 360s were affected.
I actually had 2 PS3 FATs fail on me. The first time, Sony just completely replaced it.
Was it under warranty or was it outside?
No, it was outside of warranty, but they did it anyway.
Wow, okay.
And then the second time, they gave me the option of a free replacement FAT, or I could pay $100 and get a slim 120 gig.
Nice.
And I chose the 120 gig because why not? At that point, I didn't need the back compat. I'm still, in fact, using that PS3 today.
Look at Ken, over here with all the PS3 stories I could ever hope for. I, unfortunately, didn't own a PS3 because I was poor.
And now you own like 50 of them.
Joke's on you, life. Still, the yellow light of death became a black mark on the PS3's reputation. It fueled the narrative that Sony had rushed out an overly complex, unreliable console to market. Combined with the high price tag and initial lack of must-have games, it all contributed to the PlayStation 3's properly rocky start in the console war against Microsoft's Xbox 360. The launch of the PlayStation 3 Slim in 2009 marked a crucial turning point for Sony's struggling console. After years of grappling with high production costs, hardware issues, and lackluster sales compared to its predecessor, the Slim model addressed nearly all of the original PS3 shortcomings. First, it sported a sleek new design. Gone was the bulky, scratch-prone original PS3. The Slim lived up to its name, with a more compact, streamlined look. Now, Sony also took this opportunity to rebrand, ditching the Spider-Man font for a cleaner, more modern logo. In my opinion, it's the best looking PS3 ever by far. It also had significantly better reliability. Sony had thankfully learned from the yellow light of death fiasco. It also ran significantly quieter than the notoriously loud original PlayStation 3, largely thanks to the Slim's improved power efficiency. Perhaps the most significant change, though, was the price. The PS3 Slim launched at a much more affordable $299, a far cry from the original's $600 price tag. Now, the only real downside to the Slim was the complete lack of backwards compatibility when it came to PS2 games. However, since later models of the fat PS3 had already ditched this feature, to be honest, most people were kind of over it. The response to the PS3 Slim was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Within 24 hours of its release, it became the best-selling gaming console on the market. This success came at a crucial time in the console war with the 360. While Sony had been struggling to gain traction, Microsoft had been steadily building its user base since its earlier launch in 2005. This was firstly driven by its strong launch lineup and exclusive titles. Games like Halo 3 and Gears of War were system sellers. Xbox Live was also miles ahead of Sony's PlayStation Network at the time, offering a more seamless multiplayer experience. Now, part of that is to be expected. Microsoft were on their second generation of Xbox Live, and you had to pay a pretty significant $60 per year for Xbox Live Gold, where Sony always kept PSN free on the PS3. You know, referring back to the whole, the PlayStation 3 generation keeps losing money for Sony, I don't know why. You know, that thing. But it wasn't just the fact that Xbox Live was paid. Microsoft really emphasized the social aspects of gaming, positioning the Xbox 360 as a platform for connecting with friends. There were advantages for PSN though, namely the fact that it was free to play really lowered the barrier to entry to playing with your friends, although it was clearly less reliable, with multi-platform titles like Call of Duty offering better latency and a more stable experience on Xbox Live. However, in April of 2011, Sony faced a catastrophic security breach that would threaten to derail the PS3's momentum entirely.
Sony has confirmed that hackers broke into its PlayStation network, exposing the personal information of up to 77 million users worldwide.
Hackers infiltrated the PSN, compromising the personal and financial information of approximately 77 million user accounts. This massive data breach forced Sony to shut down the entire PSN for an unprecedented 23 days, leaving millions of PS3 and PSP users unable to access online gaming or digital purchases. Just talk to anyone who worked at Sony during this time and watch their face. Dark times, man. Yeesh. The incident not only highlighted the vulnerabilities in Sony's network infrastructure, but also dealt a severe blow to gamers' trust. In the aftermath, Sony did offer users identity theft protection and a welcome back package of free games, but the damage to their reputation was significant. However, the 360 was, of course, not without its own problems. Lots of gamers were steering clear after the Red Ring of Death fiasco, and Microsoft was forced to set aside billions of dollars to extend the warranty and deliver replacements, all in the hope the gamers could be won back. And you know, they largely were, just at a hefty cost. Now, it's also worth noting that while Sony and Microsoft were duking it out in the traditional console space, Nintendo was very much off doing its own thing with the incredibly successful Wii. The motion control-based console really appealed to a broader, more casual audience, and it became a surprise hit. However, its lack of HD graphics and less powerful hardware meant that it really wasn't competing with the PS3 and the Xbox 360 for the core gamer market. In 2012, the landscape was almost unrecognizable compared to 2006 when the PS3 launched. The original PS3's complex architecture, centered around the cell processor, had been notoriously difficult to develop for. Many multi-platform games initially performed better on the Xbox 360, simply because developers found it easier to optimize for Microsoft's hardware. However, as the generation progressed and developers became more familiar with the PS3's quirks, this gap did begin to close. By the latter half of the generation, many multi-platform titles were reaching parity across both systems, and some PS3 exclusives, such as Uncharted and The Last of Us, pushed the boundaries of what was possible on console hardware. And so, when Sony revealed the final hardware revision, later known as the Super Slim, in September of 2012, it was the final form of the PS3 in more ways than one. The cost-cutting at this point had claimed everything. Of course, there was no PS2 back compat or Linux support, but it also had a new, even slimmer design that dropped the slot-loading disc tray in favor of the cheapest sliding door, probably of all time. Find me a cheaper door. They even dropped the hard drive from the base model, instead shipping it with 12 gigabytes of flash storage, so you know, the operating system functioned, but if you actually wanted to do anything with it, you pretty much had to go out and buy a hard drive yourself. Or I guess you could limit yourself to games that didn't need any extra space, which by the time 2012 rolled around, were incredibly few and far between. Now, look, I'm biased here, but I've always really disliked the Super Slim for being so absolutely cut down and cheap that it's hardly recognizable from the beastly original PS3. But this was a key reason why Sony were able to really crank up the sales in the last few years of the PlayStation 3. And this, paired with huge games released right at the end of the life cycle, such as GTA 5 and The Last of Us, meant that, miraculously, Sony barely outsold the Xbox 360 when it was all said and done. Boy, this has been the episode I've been most excited for ever since we first started making this series. There has never, and will likely never be, another generation that's just this insane. Sony came in with all the confidence in the world after dominating generation after generation. They developed an absurdly complex and ahead of its time console, which single-handedly forced Blu-ray to 2 decades of success and birthed some of the most important games of all time. And yet, it kind of fails. From a sales perspective, Sony lost billions on the PS3. And while it's debatable, I think history has shown that both the Wii and the Xbox 360s were the real winners of the generation. The Wii cemented Nintendo's pivot from competing with Sony and Microsoft to really just doing their own thing to pretty great success. Well, as long as you don't count the Wii U, I guess. And there is no doubt that the Xbox 360 was the greatest generation of Xbox ever. A high watermark that, if I'm honest, they're probably never going to top. So, how does history look back on the PlayStation 3? It was an enormously bold bet that kind of blew up in Sony's face and forced them to play on defense the entire generation. And as we'll talk about when we get to the PS4, it caused a huge shift in the way that future generations would be handled. But that is a story for later. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you missed any of the earlier episodes on the PS1, the PS2, or the PSP, definitely go check those out. Next time, we take a little detour to the console that single-handedly forced Sony to abandon the portable space. Ah, the Vita.